Work can destroy everything except hope. Thomas Parker stopped a wheelchair at a park bench, looking down at his granddaughter, who would never walk again. That's when an elderly woman raised her head, her gaze piercing through his despair. "I can make your granddaughter walk again." Thomas had walked past that park bench 100 times, but never like this. Never with a pair of tiny wheels creaking alongside his polished leather shoes. Never with silence so thick it could suffocate him. His 10-year-old granddaughter Emily sat quietly in her wheelchair, her legs still and wrapped in a knitted purple blanket. Her blonde hair fell over her cheeks, eyes lowered to the pavement, as though she had given up waiting for miracles. Thomas hadn't. Not really. But hope had become a cruel word in his world. Since the car accident 18 months ago, every doctor, therapist, and specialist had taken his money and left with the same answer: permanent spinal damage. The finest medical minds in the country had examined Emily, all reaching the same conclusion. She may live a long life, they'd say gently, but she'll never walk again. His money could build empires, but couldn't repair a single damaged nerve. The woman on the bench looked out of place in this upscale neighborhood. She was thin, with short silver hair neatly combed despite her obvious homelessness. Layers of worn clothing couldn't hide her dignified posture, ramrod straight, like someone who had stood at attention for decades. A faded metal pin to her outer jacket caught the sunlight. "Excuse me," Thomas said, certain he had misheard. "Your granddaughter," the woman repeated, her voice steady and clear. "I can help her walk again." Thomas frowned. "Is this some kind of scam? Who put you up to this?" "No one," the woman said, rising to her feet with surprising grace. "My name's Margaret Wilson, former combat medic, 67th Evac Hospital, Vietnam." Her hands, though weathered with age, moved with precision as she adjusted her jacket. "I've been watching you two come through this park. The way she holds herself, there's still connection there. Her spine isn't dead, just dormant." Emily's head turned slightly. That was more attention than she'd shown to anyone in weeks. "I've taken her to the best hospitals in the world," Thomas said firmly. "Neurologists, surgeons, even experimental therapies. There's nothing anyone can do." "But you haven't taken her to me," Margaret answered simply. Thomas studied the woman carefully. Margaret Wilson, as she called herself, didn't have the look of someone trying to con him. Her eyes, sharp blue despite her age, held something he hadn't seen in the specialist's offices: absolute certainty. "You're what, 75? Thomas asked. 75 next month," Margaret replied, not offended by the question. Was a military nurse for 30 years. Saw things in Vietnam that changed how I understood healing. "Medicine isn't just machines and medications, Mr. Parker." Thomas started. "How do you know my name?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Your face was on the cover of Forbes last month. The tech visionary reshaping Silicon Valley. I still read when I can. Libraries are warm in winter." Emily looked up at the woman, curiosity breaking through her usual detachment. "How would you help me?" she asked, her voice small but clear. Thomas put a protective hand on Emily's shoulder. "We should go, Em." "I combine what I learned in war with what I learned after it," Margaret explained, addressing Emily directly. "Western medicine saves bodies. Eastern medicine saves souls. Sometimes to heal one, you need both." "That sounds like pseudoscience," Thomas said dismissively. Margaret nodded. "To someone who builds computers, perhaps it would. But the human body isn't binary, Mr. Parker. It doesn't run on zeros and ones." Emily reached for the woman's hand unexpectedly. "Were you hurt too?" Margaret knelt beside the wheelchair, her movements betraying old injuries of her own. "Yes, child. Shrapnel in my spine. They said I'd never walk again either." Thomas's skepticism faltered. Margaret's gait had been steady, her posture upright. "I don't take money," Margaret continued. "I've never charged for healing. That was my oath as a medic, to help, not to profit." "Please, Grandpa," Emily said, turning to Thomas, the spark in her eyes. He hadn't seen it since before the accident. "Can we try?" The words "no" and "absolutely not" formed in his mind. But so did Emily's voice, the way it cracked weeks ago when she whispered, I hate being this way. If anything feels wrong, we leave immediately, Thomas said firmly. Do you understand, Em? Emily nodded eagerly. Where will we go? Thomas asked Margaret. I have a place behind the veterans shelter on Maple Street. It's not fancy, but it's clean, Margaret answered. And it is everything we need. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. Lead the way. The path to Margaret's place took them through parts of the city Thomas rarely saw. They passed through neighborhoods where his Tesla would have been stripped to its frame, where storefronts were protected by heavy metal grates even during daylight hours. Emily watched everything with wide eyes, her sheltered life having kept her from these realities. Everyone knows Margaret here. A man called from the storefront, raising his hand in greeting. Thomas noticed the man's jacket, military surplus, patches indicating service in Afghanistan. Other veterans nodded respectfully as they passed. One woman with a prosthetic leg smiled warmly at Emily. You're in good hands, little one, she said. Thomas pushed the wheelchair carefully, navigating cracked sidewalks. How many people have you treated? He asked Margaret, who walked steadily beside them. I don't keep count, she replied. Some I could help, others I couldn't. Healing is an exact science. They turned down an alley behind a veteran's shelter, where a small path led to a standalone structure. It looked like a converted garage, simple but well-maintained. Window boxes held medicinal herbs, their scent filling the air. Margaret unlocked the door. Some find it strange that I live like this when I could claim better housing with my military benefits, she said, sensing Thomas's question before he asked. But this keeps me close to those who need help most. Inside was a single room, immaculately clean despite its simplicity. One wall held medical diagrams, nervous system maps, acupuncture meridians, and anatomical drawings. Medical texts shared shelf space with ancient-looking volumes. A treatment table occupied the center of the room, with equipment that looked part modern medical, part traditional healing arts. Emily's wheelchair bumped over the threshold. Thomas winced at each jolt, almost turning back twice, but Margaret kept glancing over his shoulder with reassuring calm. My grandmother taught me that sometimes the most difficult journeys lead to the greatest healings, Margaret said quietly. Thomas noticed a shadow box on the wall containing medals, a purple heart, a bronze star, and other decorations he didn't recognize. Beside it hung a faded photograph of a much younger Margaret in uniform, standing with a group of Vietnamese villagers. We're here, Margaret said, switching on lights that bathed the room in warm illumination. Margaret washed her hands methodically at a small sink, with the thoroughness of someone who had prepped for surgery. She turned to Emily with a gentle smile. First, I need to understand what the doctors told you, she said. Thomas produced a tablet from his bag. I have all her medical records here. MRIs, consultations, treatment plans. Margaret shook her head. Not those. Emily, what did they tell you about your legs? Emily looked down. That my spinal cord got damaged in an accident. That the signals can't get through anymore. Her small fingers twisted the edge of her blanket. That I should focus on what I can do, not what I can't. Margaret nodded. Good advice, but incomplete. The body remembers how to heal itself. Sometimes it just needs to be reminded. She turned to Thomas. May I examine her back? After Thomas's nod, Margaret helped Emily onto the treatment table, positioning her carefully on her stomach. With practiced hands, she gently examined Emily's spine, her fingers detecting subtleties no machine could register. The damage is real, Margaret confirmed, but so is a potential for reconnection. She retrieved several items. Small glass cups, a jar of herbal ointment that filled the room with an unfamiliar scent, and what looked like acupuncture needles. In Vietnam, I worked with local healers when our medical supplies ran low, Margaret explained as she prepared. They taught me techniques older than Western medicine. Cupping to stimulate blood flow, acupuncture to reawaken nerve pathways, and manual therapy to realign energy. Energy? Thomas questioned skeptically. Bioelectricity, if you prefer scientific terms. Margaret replied without looking up. The body generates its own electrical field. These techniques can influence it. She worked methodically, placing the cups along Emily's spine. She inserted needles at specific points on Emily's legs, her movements precise and confident. All the while, she hummed a low, melodic sound, almost like a prayer. After 20 minutes, she removed the cups and needles, then applied the herbal ointment with gentle strokes. This contains compounds that reduce inflammation and promote nerve regeneration, she explained. Some ingredients come from plants that don't even have English names. As she worked, she spoke softly to Emily about courage and patience, about how healing begins with belief. "I feel something," Emily suddenly whispered. Like tiny bubbles in my legs." Thomas stepped forward in alarm. "That's good," Margaret said calmly. "Your nerves are remembering their purpose." She looked at Thomas. "This is just the beginning. The body heals in its own time." She helped Emily turn over, then placed her hands gently on the girl's knees. "Can you try to feel my touch?" she asked. Emily's face concentrated, then lit up. I think I can. I feel it," Emily repeated, tears forming in her eyes. "Grandpa, I can feel her hands." Thomas rushed forward, kneeling beside the table. "Are you sure, Em? You're not just imagining it." Emily shook her head vigorously. "It's like when your foot falls asleep and then wakes up, all tingly and strange." Margaret stepped back, giving them space. Her face remained composed, as though this miracle were simply the expected outcome of her work. Can you move your toes?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily's face screwed up in concentration. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, her right big toe twitched. Thomas gasped. The movement was tiny, but undeniable. A movement doctors had said would never happen again. "Margaret," he said, turning to the elderly veteran, "how is this possible?" "The body knows how to heal itself," Margaret repeated. "Sometimes conventional medicine gives up too easily when the path isn't obvious." She stepped closer to Emily. "Would you like to try standing?" Fear flashed across Emily's face. "What if I fall?" "Then we'll catch you," Margaret said simply. "But you won't." With Thomas on one side and Margaret on the other, they helped Emily to a sitting position, then eased her legs over the edge of the table. Her feet, in colorful mismatched socks, dangled above the floor. "Remember," Margaret instructed, "don't try to walk yet. Just focus on feeling the ground beneath your feet." They lowered her slowly until her feet touched the floor. Emily gasped, overwhelmed by sensation. "I can feel it," she whispered. "The floor, it's cold." Thomas couldn't hold back his tears. For 18 months, he had watched his granddaughter trapped in a body half dead to her. Now he was witnessing life returning, one sensation at a time. "Try put some weight on your legs," Margaret guided. "We'll support you." Emily gripped their hands tightly as she shifted slightly forward. Her legs trembled violently, but held. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, Emily stood, wobbling like a newborn fawn, but standing. Then her knees buckled. Thomas caught her before she could fall, sweeping her into his arms. "You stood, Em," he said through tears. "You stood on your own." As Thomas helped Emily back into her wheelchair, his mind raced with questions. He turned to Margaret, who was calmly cleaning her instruments. "Who are you?" "Really?" he asked. "No homeless veteran has these skills." Margaret smiled faintly. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Parker. I am exactly who I said, Margaret Wilson, combat medic, 67th Evac Hospital." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a long scar running from wrist to elbow. 1968, near Quang Tri. Our medical convoy hit a mine. I was thrown 30 feet. Woke up 3 days later with shrapnel in my spine and the prognosis that I'd never walk again. Thomas listened, captivated despite himself. The military hospital did what they could, but medicine had limits then, even more than now. Margaret continued. After 2 months, they were preparing to ship me home, another broken soldier. But one of our Vietnamese interpreters offered an alternative. She moved the photograph on the wall, pointing to an elderly Vietnamese woman. Ba Hoa, Grandmother Flower, we called her. She was a village healer. Against regulations, against all protocol, my commanding officer allowed her to treat me. And it worked. Emily asked, her eyes wide. Margaret nodded. 6 weeks of treatments. Similar to what I just gave you. When I returned to duty, my commanding officer made me swear never to reveal how I'd recovered. It would have damaged a career in mine. So you learned her techniques? Thomas asked. I became her student. Every off-duty hour, I studied with her. When my tour ended, I re-enlisted, specifically requesting Vietnam. I spent 4 more years there, working in military medicine while learning traditional healing. Thomas frowned. But why are you homeless with your military pension? I'm not homeless by necessity, Mr. Parker. I choose to live simply, close to those who need help most, veterans who fall through the cracks of our system. She smiled sadly. Many of my patients can't afford traditional health care. They wouldn't set foot in fancy offices or hospitals. Does it always work? This treatment. Thomas gestured to Emily, who was flexing her toes in wonder. Margaret shook her head. Nothing always works. But for those like Emily, where the connection isn't severed but dormant, yes, often it does. The body remembers. It just needs to be reminded. Why help us? Thomas asked. We're not veterans. Because she needed help, Margaret answered simply. And because I took an oath to heal. That doesn't expire with discharge papers. Thomas reached for his wallet. Name your price. Whatever you want. Margaret held up her hand. I told you, I don't take money for healing. Everyone has a price, Thomas insisted. A new facility? Medical supplies? A proper home? Margaret shook her head. What I do isn't about equipment or comfort. It's about connection, something money can't buy. She looked at Emily. Your granddaughter will need more sessions. The healing has begun, but it needs to continue. Emily looked up eagerly. Can we come back tomorrow? Yes, Margaret said. 3 times a week for at least a month. Each time, we'll work a little more, strengthen those awakening pathways. Thomas stared at the simple room, at this extraordinary woman who lived among society forgotten. He had spent millions on Emily's treatments, on specialists who had declared her condition irreversible. Yet here in this humble space, he had witnessed the impossible. There must be something I can do, he said finally. Some way to thank you. Margaret was quiet for a moment. There is something, but it's not for me. She gestured to the veterans' shelter visible through her small window. Many there need help that the system doesn't provide. Specialized equipment, treatments the VA won't cover, transportation to appointments. Thomas understood immediately. Consider it done. I'll set up a foundation. Not just money, Margaret added. Attention, recognition. Many fought for this country only to be forgotten by it. Thomas nodded solemnly. I have connections in Washington. Board positions with major healthcare providers. I'll make sure they're not forgotten. As they prepared to leave, Emily reached for Margaret's hand. Will I really walk normally again? Margaret smiled. With time and work, yes. But remember, you were never broken, just disconnected from yourself. Emily nodded, understanding beyond her years. Thank you for showing me how to reconnect. 3 months later, Emily stood at the entrance of the rehabilitation center, a walker her only support. Inside, children with similar conditions waited with their parents, all there at Thomas's invitation. Ready? Thomas asked, offering his hand. Emily shook her head. I want to do this myself. Step by small step, she walked through the doors. The gathered families applauded. Reporters documented every moment. When asked by journalists about her miraculous recovery, Emily smiled. A veteran showed me that healing starts by believing it's possible. Thomas stood at the podium afterward, announcing the Margaret Wilson Foundation for Veteran Health, a multi-million-dollar initiative combining conventional and alternative treatments for veterans. In the back of the room, Margaret watched quietly, still in her simple clothes, still preferring anonymity. She didn't need recognition. The spark rekindled in Emily's eyes, and now in the eyes of these other children, was all the reward she sought. That evening, Margaret sat with young veterans struggling with phantom limb pain. As she had done hundreds of times before, she listened, treated, and taught, passing on the knowledge that had once saved her. Healing rarely comes from a single source. Sometimes it requires science and faith, modern medicine, and ancient wisdom, a doctor's training, and a warrior's resolve. Emily's story reminds us that sometimes the most profound help comes from those society overlooks. That true healing addresses both body and spirit. That compassion from unexpected sources can change lives. If you found meaning in this story, please share it with someone who needs hope. And tell us in the comments, what unexpected person changed your life? Your stories of respect and gratitude inspire us all.